A man is executed. A month later, he walks back into his village, alive. Who really died that day? And how did the justice system let a murderer slip through its hands? The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and gunpowder. A group of officers led a man to the execution site, his hands tightly bound, his head covered with a black hood. The ground beneath his feet was uneven, soaked from the rain the night before. A single shot echoed through the air, silencing whatever thoughts had been running through his mind in his final moments. His body collapsed, blood pooling beneath him, as the execution squad lowered their rifles. The paperwork was signed. The case was closed. The man executed was recorded as Tang Jianmin, a convicted felon responsible for multiple robberies, assaults and fraud. Officials sent notice to his family, instructing them to retrieve his remains. But there was no mourning, no outburst of grief. His father's response was strangely indifferent. He refused to claim the body. A month later, the impossible happened. Tang Jianmen returned to his village. His face was gaunt, weathered from years of labor in distant provinces, but he was unmistakably alive. The villagers stared at him, their expressions a mix of horror and disbelief. To them, he was a ghost, someone who should not exist. He claimed he had never been to the city of Yichang, where he was supposedly arrested, tried, and executed. He had committed no crimes, yet he had been legally pronounced dead. The shock of his return raised one question. If Tang Jianmin was alive, who had been executed in his place? The answer lay buried in an older case, one that had begun in the summer of 1997. A bloated corpse was found floating in a murky pond on the outskirts of Xiangzhou district, Xiangyang city. The body had been in the water for days. When the police pulled it onto dry land, the full extent of the brutality was revealed. The victim's face had been destroyed, the skull fractured by a heavy object. His neck bore deep bruises, evidence of strangulation. The attack had been precise and merciless. 4 men arrived at the police station later that day, claiming they knew the victim's identity. He was Li Jun, a 23-year-old security officer at the city hospital. The men also had another shocking revelation. They knew who had killed him. They named 2 individuals, Zhang Wenhua and Xu Hao. The details were chilling. According to their statements, Wenhua had called them after the crime, confessing that he and Hao had killed Li Jun as part of a test of courage. There was no apparent financial motive, no deep-seated grudge, just a need to prove themselves. The police had little to work with. There were no witnesses to the murder, no physical evidence pointing to a suspect. Then, they received an anonymous letter. The writer confessed in detail to the crime, outlining how the murder was carried out. It described how the victim had been restrained, how a rope had tightened around his neck for 20 minutes, how a hammer was used to ensure he would not survive. The letter named both Wenhua and Hao as the perpetrators. Shortly after, another letter arrived, reinforcing the confession. This time, it included a hand-drawn map pinpointing where the body had been disposed of and where the suspects had abandoned the victim's belongings. The police moved quickly, treating the letters as indisputable evidence. The man named in both letters, Xu Hao, was arrested within days. He was a music teacher with no history of violence or criminal behavior. He claimed he had nothing to do with the crime, but it did not matter. The letters were damning. The confession had been written down. The details were precise. He was interrogated for weeks. At first, he denied any involvement. Then, his story changed. Under intense pressure, he admitted to participating in the murder. He told police that Zhang Wenhua had planned everything, that it was Wenhua who wanted to kill Li Jun over a dispute related to prostitution. Hao had allegedly agreed to help and had been promised a share of the money from selling the victim's motorcycle. The confession sealed his fate. A year later, he stood in court, withdrawing his admission of guilt. He claimed he had been coerced, that his previous statements had been dictated by the investigators, and that he had been forced to sign them. He had an alibi. He had spent that night with a woman, but no one listened. The court dismissed his retraction, concluding that he had no way to prove his innocence. Despite this, the prosecution's case had weaknesses. No forensic evidence connected Hao to the crime. No fingerprints, no DNA, no physical link. The supposed murder weapon was never found. A knife recovered near the pond did not bear his fingerprints. The footprints at the crime scene did not match his shoes. But the trial continued, and the weight of the letters became impossible to overcome. The judges ruled that although direct evidence was lacking, the letters provided enough circumstantial proof of his guilt. His inability to disprove his involvement was considered further confirmation. The verdict was delivered. Xu Hao was guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to a suspended death penalty. Zhang Wenhua, however, was nowhere to be found. He had vanished, leaving Hao to take the fall alone. The investigation into Wenhua's whereabouts eventually led to a discovery that should have changed everything. When authorities finally captured him in Yichang years later, he was using the identity of another man, Tang Jianmin. He had managed to elude police for years, slipping through legal cracks by assuming a new identity. When he was finally arrested, the justice system moved swiftly, condemning him under the false name without realizing who he truly was. On the morning of June 6, 2002, Zhang Wenhua, the true murderer of Li Jun, was executed as Tang Jianmin. No one ever learned his real name until the true Jianmin reappeared a month later, proving that the legal system had unknowingly killed the wrong man. But the tragedy did not end there. Wenhua's execution meant that he could never be questioned again. The one person who could have testified about what had really happened on the night of Li Jun's murder was gone. And because the justice system had relied so heavily on his letters, Xu Hao remained in prison, still carrying the burden of a crime he swore he did not commit. By the time Wenhua's true identity was confirmed, the truth had already been buried. Hao's appeals continued to be rejected. The courts refused to reopen the case. It would take another 14 years before a new investigation was finally ordered, and even then, no progress was made. For years, Hao's mother travelled across the country, knocking on every door she could, trying to get someone, anyone, to listen. But the legal system that had failed her son remained unmoved. When her husband passed away from a stroke in 2004, she carried on alone, dedicating every breath to proving her son's innocence. The system had executed a killer under the wrong name. It had convicted a man without evidence. And yet, no one was willing to admit the mistake. For Xu Hao, the question was no longer whether he would ever be exonerated. The question was whether he would live long enough to see the truth come to light. By the time authorities realized their mistake, it was too late. The man they had executed as Tang Jianmin no longer existed. Not in records, not in legal documents, not even in the memories of those who had handled his case. He was nothing more than a ghost, a fabricated identity that had concealed the real Zhang Wenhua, a murderer who had managed to manipulate the justice system even in death. For Xu Hao, the discovery of Wenhua's true identity should have been a turning point. But instead, it was a cruel reminder of the indifference of the system that had condemned him. The courts refused to acknowledge that a man executed under a false name had also been the sole accuser in his case. The two events, Wenhua's execution and Hao's conviction, were treated as separate matters, despite the fact that one had directly led to the other. Hao had spent years behind bars, watching time slip away as he fought to prove his innocence. He had become a case number, a forgotten file buried in the archives of the judicial system. His appeals were rejected time and time again, each denial reinforcing the reality that the law did not seek the truth. It sought closure. His mother, Zhao Keifu, carried the weight of his fight alone. She had become a fixture in government offices, her presence barely acknowledged as she pleaded for someone, anyone, to reinvestigate her son's case. Officials treated her as a nuisance, a woman who refused to accept reality. The whispers followed her wherever she went. "She's the mother of a killer," they said, as if repetition could make it true. Meanwhile, the evidence against Hao had never been anything more than words on paper. 2 letters, supposedly written by Wenhua, had been the foundation of the case against him. The contents of those letters were gruesome, detailing the murder in ways that only the killer could know. But even at the time of the trial, there had been inconsistencies. The method of the killing described in the letters contradicted the forensic report. The timeline did not match witness testimonies. The location of the murder weapon was never confirmed. Yet none of these discrepancies had been enough to challenge the narrative that had been constructed against him. What no one had questioned was Wenhua's motive in writing those letters. Why would a murderer incriminate himself unless he had something to gain? The most logical answer was that he had been setting up a scapegoat from the very beginning. Wenhua had understood the psychology of law enforcement. He knew that if he provided investigators with a clear suspect, they would follow the trail he had created rather than looking deeper. It was a tactic used by serial manipulators. Control the narrative, control the outcome. When Hao was arrested, he had been isolated for weeks, interrogated without respite until his resistance was worn down. His confession had not been voluntary. It had been extracted through exhaustion, coercion, and fear. And once he had signed his names to that piece of paper, it no longer mattered whether it was true. The system did not care about the circumstances of a confession, only that one existed. As years passed, Hao's spirit deteriorated. He stopped believing in the possibility of freedom. His letters to his mother became shorter, his words devoid of hope. Zhao Keifu watched as her son, once a man who had dedicated his life to music, turned into someone unrecognizable, someone who no longer spoke of the future, only of endings. In 2009, after yet another failed appeal, he wrote his mother a letter that shattered her resolve. He no longer wished to fight. He asked her to stop wasting her life on a cause that had no victory. And then, in a final devastating plea, he asked the court to sentence him to immediate execution so his mother would no longer have to suffer. But Zhao Keifu refused to accept defeat. Even as her son lost faith, she continued, because giving up meant that Wenhua had won, even in death. She sought out journalists, human rights lawyers, anyone who would listen. And for the first time in years, people began to pay attention. In 2016, nearly 2 decades after his conviction, the Supreme People's Procuratorate ordered a review of Hao's case. It was the moment Zhao had been fighting for. But even then, the process moved at a glacial pace. Files were lost, Officials stalled investigations. Those responsible for his wrongful conviction had either retired or refused to comment. The legal system was not designed to correct its mistakes. It was designed to bury them. Yet Hao's case was no longer just about him. It was about every wrongful conviction that had ever been swept aside in the name of efficiency. It was about a system that valued the illusion of justice over its actual pursuit. It was about a mother who had spent her entire life fighting for a truth that the world refused to see. But as the years dragged on, with no resolution in sight, the question remained: would justice come before it was too late? Or had the system already decided that some mistakes were simply too inconvenient to fix? As the years stretched on, the fight for Xu Hao's innocence became a battle against time itself. The legal process was deliberately slow, every step tangled in bureaucratic red tape. Zhao Kefu's persistence had forced the authorities to acknowledge the case, but that was where their willingness ended. Even with the Supreme People's Procuratorate ordering a reinvestigation, no real progress was made. The officials involved in the original conviction had either retired or vanished into higher positions within the legal system. No one wanted to reopen a case that would expose a failure of such magnitude. For Zhao, the reality of her struggle became clear. The system did not care about righting a wrong. It cared about preserving its authority. To admit that Xu Hao had been convicted on fabricated evidence would mean acknowledging the deep flaws within the judiciary, something no official was willing to do. Hao, meanwhile, had stopped believing in the possibility of freedom. He had spent nearly 2 decades behind bars, watching prisoners come and go, their sentences ending while his remained indefinite. His days blurred into each other, the passing of time marked only by the occasional visit from his mother. The young man who had once taught music to children was gone. What remained was someone hollowed out by years of confinement, his hope drained by a system designed to keep him forgotten. The weight of the wrongful conviction bore down on every aspect of his life. He was not just imprisoned physically, but mentally, locked inside the story that had been written for him. Every day he awoke to the same reality. He was a murderer in the eyes of the law, and nothing he said would change that. Zhao's fight had begun as a mother's desperate attempt to save her son, but over time, it had become something larger. She was no longer just seeking justice for Hao. She was exposing the cracks in an entire system. The more she uncovered, the clearer it became that her son was not the only victim of legal indifference. There were others, nameless and faceless, buried in the same machinery that had consumed Hao. She travelled across the country, gathering signatures, speaking to human rights activists, demanding media coverage. Journalists began revisiting the case, questioning the validity of the original conviction. For the first time in years, the silence surrounding Hao's story was beginning to break. Yet the legal system remained unmoved. The courts stalled proceedings, delaying reviews with excuses about missing documents and procedural complications. It was clear that they were waiting for Zhao to grow too old, for public interest to fade, for time to erase the urgency of the case. Hao, watching from inside his prison cell, understood this better than anyone. In one of his letters to his mother, he wrote that he was tired, not just of being locked away, but of being a burden to her fight. He no longer asked about the case's progress. He no longer spoke of appeals or exoneration. He only asked about the world outside, about the life he would never get to live. The hardest part of Zhao's battle was knowing that even if she won, she could never give those years back to her son. The system had already taken them. If Hao was freed, he would not return to the life he had lost. he would emerge as a man who had been shaped by years of wrongful imprisonment, a man who no longer recognized himself. As the case dragged on, the question shifted from whether he would be proven innocent to whether he would live long enough to see it happen. Zhao had spent nearly 20 years demanding justice, but the courts had spent just as long ensuring that justice was unreachable. The reality was undeniable. The legal system was not designed to admit its mistakes. It was designed to bury them.